Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and we are coming to you at my own studio of the making. The studio that we normally air from is not up and running. We'll be up and running next week. We are those persons that believe, along with a lot of others, that the show must go on, and so we are making accommodation that we don't normally have to make when we are, in fact, operating from the normal setting. But be that as it may, we are in fact meeting again on Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We're glad to have you with us at WFOV 92.1, where we air there on that particular radio station on Saturdays at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And we are, of course, always available on YouTube, and you can tune us in at your leisure any time of the week, 24 hours a day. Glad to have you aboard, and hope you'll stay tuned for the next hour for some exciting things that we do here. And we try to cover some topics that you might not have had covered anywhere else. And our perspectives are our own perspectives. We don't we don't borrow from anybody else because nobody's buying into a lot of what we talk about here. But we try to give you a fresh look at some of the things that everyone else is reporting on, but maybe a different perspective than the perspective we have here at our studio. I want to start off, and sometimes I don't even know where we should start because there's so much that needs to be covered. But I got up this morning and was reading through some of the articles that came out in this continuing episode of Get Donald Trump. And that's what all of this is about, to in fact rescind the electoral outcome of November 2016. And neither the Democrats or the Republicans have accepted the verdict of the American people. And they are, and I'm talking about both Republicans and Democrats, are trying to overturn the election outcome because they don't buy into this idea, as quiet as it's kept, that the American people have the right to decide upon their own representatives if that decision is different from the decision that is, in fact, ensconced by the rulers of the country who really are running the country from behind the scene, and they do not believe their power should be checked by something as annoying as the verdict of the American people. I mean, they want to run it no matter what the American people say. And the mere fact that Donald Trump had 63 million voters that endorsed his campaign, that can be explained, by the way. The Russians caused it. The Russians are coming. And you heard back in the day where the Russians were coming, we're still waiting for them to arrive. Moscow is a lot further away, probably located on the moon. And they've not arrived yet, but they've been coming for the last, ever since 1917. And so they're coming again. This time they came to interfere with our election. And the election outcome, Donald Trump being elected, was not because Donald Trump ran a better campaign, was a better candidate, but Donald Trump is president because the Russians stole the election from the American people. And that episodic version of what occurred in the election in 2016 continues this very day. This morning they had two articles that I was going through in preparing for the program, and one of the articles I think indicates that very highlights that. One article is titled "Analysis: Trump's Legal Woes Worsen," and the other article is Russian efforts to influence the 2016 election targeted African Americans. So, the African American vote was in fact targeted by the Russians to change the outcome of the election, and black people voted 90% for the Democrat, but the Russians were targeting the black vote to turn the election outcome in a different direction than what would have ensued if they had not, in fact, involved themselves in coming out to help elect Donald Trump. And if they were in fact targeting the black vote, they did a very poor job because blacks voted for the Democratic candidate, in this case Hillary Clinton, to the same level or something similar to what they had done during the 2 terms of Obama's administration. So the idea that they were there to influence the outcome and the outcome therefore is illegitimate cannot be verified based upon the data that we have. For example, they're saying that, let me read one of the articles, some of the contents of the article here, for example. The article that is titled Trump's Legal Woes Worsen. Now, when you read the article, you would think then that the article would in fact validate that Trump's legal woes are in fact getting worse. But when you read the articles, here's what you read that shows the very opposite of that. The article says it's unclear what legal jeopardy, if any, Trump might be in. And long-standing Justice Department guidelines state that a sitting president cannot be indicted. So his legal woes worsen. At the same time, in the article, is saying that it's unclear what legal jeopardy, if any, Trump might be in. And long-standing Justice Department guidelines state that a sitting president cannot even be indicted. So what kind of legal jeopardy is worsening? If that would be true, then what's the worsening condition that Donald Trump is in? But the sentencing, I'm reading again from the article, but the sentencing of former Trump attorney Michael Cohen and revelation that the parent company of the National Enquirer has turned state's evidence established clear links between the president and illegal actions his former allies say he directed. Now, what are the illegal actions taken by the president? What are those illegal actions? Well, the illegal actions are Cohen and American Media Incorporated say they made payments to a former Playboy model and adult film actress to help Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, a move that federal prosecutors say was a campaign a campaign finance violation. So let me get this straight. If you pay money out of your own pocket so that you don't want some embarrassing information to come before the public, you're paying money out of your own pocket to pay what amounts to hush money because it will embarrass you for a number of reasons. One, you have a family, you're married, and you also run for president of the United States. But the other parts of it, it doesn't matter because the fact is that he's running for president, so all the other things that might have been the reason why he wanted to pay to silence the person that can embarrass him, all that doesn't count. It's a campaign violation for him to pay somebody to keep quiet. And so therefore, this is, according to the article, this is a federal campaign finance violation. Now, don't forget that we have paid off, I'm talking about when I say we, the taxpayers, have paid off 268, I would imagine women, because men, if you're sexually harassing the men, I don't think too many of us would complain about that. But the women, they paid off 268, I would say mostly women, taxpayers' money because they have a kitty set up in the Congress to pay off women who claim that members of the Congress have harassed them, and to make it go away, they have paid off more than 260 women to silence them from coming public to embarrass members of Congress. That's taxpayers' money, but nobody has made the claim that this is, in fact, money that is a violation of the Finance Committee, the campaign finance violation laws. But Donald Trump coming out of his own pocket, not charging to the taxpayers, that's a campaign violation. And that article, by the way, comes out of the New York Times. Now, the other article, the one that Russian effort to influence 2016 election, target African-American voters, that one that comes out of the Washington Post. And that's important also because the Washington Post and New York Times have a two-tiered attack upon the election outcome that occurred in 2016, and they are determined to do with Donald Trump what they did with Richard Milhous Nixon, which is, in fact, take Donald Trump out of power as it took out of power the 37th president of the United States, because we had a coup d'etat in this country. In 1974, we had a coup d'etat that took Richard Nixon out of power. There is a way to take presidents out of power, but it has nothing to do with how Richard Nixon was forced out of power in August of 1974. The Article 2, Section 4 was never invoked, and a lot of persons are yet to understand that the impeachment process was not used in getting Richard Nixon to stand down. Richard Nixon was hounded out of office, and he was hounded out of office by the same press that is after Donald Trump. The press is trying to run Donald Trump out of power, and the press ran Richard Nixon out of power almost more than 3 decades ago. Here's how the process would have played out if it had gone through the legal process. In Article 2, I keep coming back to this over and over again, in Article 2, Section 4, there is a way to remove the president, and this process was never invoked, mainly because the framers made it very difficult, almost impossible, to remove a president other than through the voting process. And that's why they made it difficult, because to remove a president after he's been duly elected by the American people, you need to make that process very, very difficult, because the impeachment process is not a legal process, it's a political process. And they wanted to make it difficult for you to politically remove a president just in case a majority party was in the Congress and was in a different party than the president. They want to make it very difficult for the majority party to take the majority and then use it against a president duly elected by the American people. So although you can impeach a president by the majority vote in the House, to then refer the matter of the impeachment, and don't forget the impeachment is only official accusation of wrongdoing while in office, although they're trying to say that it also applies to what, in this case, what Donald Trump did before he assumed office. So you can actually do impeachable offenses before you actually take office. It applies to before and also after. And I don't think I don't think I've ever heard that one before, where a president can be impeached before he's inaugurated into office. So whatever Donald Trump did before January the 20th, 2017, whatever occurred before that, he's actionable. You can take action against his behavior before he is in fact installed in office, as well as what he does in the aftermath of being inaugurated. So we got a new standard now of how you remove a president. But the way you remove a president is made very difficult by the framers. The president and the vice president and all other civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment, that is a charge. And then after charging the president, and you charge the president in the House, and then you refer the matter to the Senate, And the Senate, the ante goes up because in the Senate, you now must have a 2/3 vote of the senators. So 218 members, if you have a majority in the House, 218 members, since there are 435 members in the House, you have to have, if the whole House is sitting, you have to have 218 of those 435 votes to bring about impeachment. That's assuming all of them are in fact voting. But when you refer the impeachment over to the Senate for trial, and of course the person that sits over the trial, since this is the president, is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Article 3. So the Chief Justice presides over the hearing of the case. It takes a 2/3 vote of the senators to bring about conviction. Not a majority as it was in the House of Representatives, but a 2/3 vote in the Senate. If that doesn't happen, then the president is not removed. And that's why you've had two presidents, Andrew Johnson in 1867, really in 1868, if you want to say when the impeachment itself would have occurred. But he failed to be convicted and therefore is not removed from office by Article 2, Section 4, because they failed by one vote to convict the president on the impeachment charge. And the charge, by the way, was a bogus charge in this case as well. And I'll make a statement about why this is so important to be aware of later on in our presentation here. But the charge against Andrew Johnson, the president that succeeded Abraham Lincoln, when Lincoln was assassinated April the 14th, 1865, Johnson from Tennessee, Democrat, by the way, so you removed a Republican president and installed a Democratic president in his place. But we're not supposed to think of any conspiracy in back of it. It was all one man having done that, of course, John Wilkes Booth, singularly, without any conspiratorial arrangement. Nobody else was involved in it, although they hang Mary Silkret and others. The only woman I think we've ever, if I'm not mistaken, hung in the history of this country. And certain others were hung as well, but yet we're supposed to have only one person involved in the killing of the president, the 16th president. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that when they impeached Andrew Johnson, they impeached Andrew Johnson because Johnson was trying to fire a member of his own cabinet. The Congress took the position that if you have the cabinet members confirmed by the Senate, then if you're going to get rid of them, then the reverse should be true. You must have the okay of the Senate to then reverse the process in terms of removal of an office holder, even a member of the president's cabinet. If you're going to remove the person of the president's cabinet, then you have to have the Senate's approval to get rid of the person that was endorsed by the Senate to place him in the office in which he had. And so Edwin Stanton, who was the secretary the president's secretary of war, the president wanted to remove him because he'd been appointed under Lincoln. The position of the Congress was you must have our approval to bring that result about, which is laughable because then you don't have the separation of powers. That is, say the president does not have the right to control the executive branch of government under Article 2 because the Article 1 is invoked to bring about their approval of what the president is doing in his sector of the three-tiered part of the federal government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. So they're trying to say that he had violated the Tenure of Office Act, and therefore, having violated that, the president should be removed from office, and so on and so forth. And that failed by one vote. And so the president was impeached, but the president was not removed. And that's very important to understand because they recognize right now, since they did not win, I'm talking about the Democrats, did not win control of both houses of the Congress. That's what they were really crying about after the election was over, the midterm elections, because they were really thinking they were going to be able to, in fact, have a majority of Democrats in the House and a majority of Democrats in the Senate. They thought they'd be able to control both chambers of the Congress, and they did not do that. And they were crying the next day because they understand that even if they bring about the impeachment in the House, you don't really have the process going forward with the removal, which is what is intended, unless you control the Senate and you can get a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And that's what they're working on right now. That's why you have all these attacks being made on a constant basis, because they're trying to do what they did with Richard Nixon. What they did with Richard Nixon was to, in fact, drive down the approval of Nixon so that nobody could stand behind him because of the endangerment to their own political careers if they, in fact, go out and support an unpopular president who's being injured by the news reports of how this man is such a criminal in the White House and therefore must be removed. Anyone that gets him back, that backs him up, they must therefore be doing some things that are criminal as well, because why would they be supporting a president that is, in fact, doing all these things that are injurious to the nation's well-being politically? So you see the same scheme going on now that went on back in from 1972 to 1974. And they kept, when you talk about Watergate, they kept Watergate in the news for 2 years until the American people caught on to the idea that Nixon must be removed from office because this criminal politician must be removed from office because he's violating the canons of the government of the United States. And look at how this man has criminalized the presidency. And this, of course, is unusual in terms of what goes on with the president, because basically we have the George Washington types in power, and he has corrupted the political process, which otherwise is going along with these presidents that have been great. And Richard Nixon was a crook, and he must be removed because look at what he's doing compared to what the others were doing. Of course, that's a matter of what was reported during the other president's time, and what they're reporting on with Richard Nixon was totally was something different. Nobody was reporting about what Kennedy was doing. Nobody was reporting about what Johnson was doing. And Johnson was doing a lot more than what Kennedy was doing, and nobody was reporting that. But when Nixon got in there, that was when the shan hit the fan. And Nixon's got to go, even though duly elected by the American people. He had to go. And I look at these persons that are right now trying to do the same thing to Donald Trump that did what they did to Richard Nixon. And they're the same people. Carl Bernstein, one of the authors of the book called All the President's Men, along with this other Washington Post, don't forget this is the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, both of those writers, those reporters for the Washington Post, did they're the ones who wrote the book called All the President's Men. And they had Haldeman, Ehrlichman, John Dean, and by the way, John Dean's out there trying to fan the impeachment against Donald Trump. Don't forget he turned. We're talking about Michael Cohen. John Dean turned on Richard Nixon. Michael Cohen turned. He was the attorney for Donald Trump, and Michael Cohen has turned on Donald Trump. We're seeing the same scenario that played out in '74, playing out again in 2018. And Michael Cohen is not the first one to do what he's doing. And we have the same thing played out 3 decades ago. And so, John, is that the signal? Okay, I thought John was giving me the signal for the break for WFOV. No, we've been down this road before. And what we have here is a plan coup d'etat in the United States. They intend and have intended ever since this election went on November the 8th, 2016, they intend to overturn the election results in this country. They do not intend to have the verdict of the American people prevail in the United States because they've said otherwise, and the verdict of the American people differs from their verdict, and they intend to overthrow that verdict. That's what this is about.
We're coming up on 26 right now.
Okay, and John said we're coming up on 26 minutes at this point, so we are going to pause and let WFOV 92.1 identify itself, and they'll come back after the 4-minute break, and we will pick it up for them on the other side of the break while continuing with what we're saying here on allpointstv.com. We have to understand what's going on here. Everyone keeps saying how this is what happens in a third. This is what happens in a third world country. And we have this notion that our politics in this country differs from the politics in third world countries, and somehow it does not play out the same way here that it does in other parts of the world. As if our politicians are from a higher moral plane, high moral calling than the politicians are in other parts of the world, such as North Korea and Russia, you name the countries. Where the fact of the matter is that politicians are not different than where you find them anywhere in the world. They're all the same. We have criminals running this country just like we have criminals running the countries in other parts of the world. And the only thing that restrains them here, more so than they're restrained elsewhere, is the founding documents of the country that sought to, at the outset of this country, to restrain the politicians. And let me read something here that would validate that, because this idea that that our politicians are benevolent, and that in fact they're so benevolent they have given us a Bill of Rights, and it comes from our government and things of that sort. I want to read to you something from the Declaration of Independence to show you that the framers were very much aware of who politicians are. Not only they weren't past. This is not the Declaration of Independence is not speaking to the potential problems around the world. They're talking about the potential problems here. And if you read the Declaration of Independence carefully, you'll see they made 27 accusations against King George III. Let me read a couple of them and see if you don't see this in our Constitution. He, meaning King George III, he has combined with others to subject us, meaning those in the colonies, to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, given his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, meaning that the Parliament is violating our laws here, and the King of England is going along with those violations. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment from any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Now, why is that important in the Declaration of Independence? Because those are restraints placed upon power in the Constitution in what they call the Bill of Rights. But here in the Declaration of Independence, you have Thomas Jefferson complaining about these violations on the part of the government that is headed by King George III. So those violations are put in place to restrain government once they set a constitution up here in the United States, they placed those restraints upon the government based upon the fact that they were complaining about the violations under King George III. Okay, welcome back from the break, those of you who are coming back from WFOV. We're still ranting here about how we misunderstand what the framers were doing in the Constitution. They did not feel they had sufficiently restrained power in the first 7 articles of the Constitution. And they only ratified the Constitution in 1788 with the idea that they would further amend the document by adding to the restraints upon government power with additional restraints placed in the Constitution. 3 years after the Constitution was ratified, they then invoked other restraints in 1791. You can call it the Bill of Rights if you want to, but our rights don't come from government. Our rights are inherent rights, natural rights, or as they say in the Declaration, inalienable rights. Let's see, in the Declaration of Independence, the second paragraph, I keep coming back to it because we have to continue to reinforce this idea of what the framers had in mind was that our rights don't come from the government. And if it does, woe be unto all of us, because government has always been a taker of our liberties around the world and throughout history. And if our rights come from government, we are indeed in trouble, because government is a liberty-taking institution, not a government that, in fact, is liberty-granting. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. And that brings me back to this book written by the Kennedy brothers. Their book, several books that they've written, but the one that I think is key is their book called The South Was Right. And they talk about the Yankee myth of history. And somebody ought to, in the listening audience, should go and read this book, because what we have is a Yankee version of history. And the Yankee version of history is that the government is benevolent, and what they were trying to do in this case, out of their benevolence, was to, in fact, free the slaves, and they were fighting a war, the equivalent of 5 to 6 million people killed. I'm saying equivalent numbers because they were a country we were a country at that time of 33 million people, and of the 600,000 that were killed, that's equivalent to 5 million to 6 million people killed between 1861 to 1865. So the benevolence of the government caused the death of the equivalent of 6 million people, because their goal was to get rid of slavery in the United States, and they were fighting a war on behalf of the enslaved population, and that's why 6 million people died in this country. And that's such a fraudulent claim, that and such a outrageous claim. It's so absurd. You wonder how they've been able to get away with this nonsense all these years, and they're still getting away with it, because that's not what this war was about. And you can continue to make this claim that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest president this country has produced, as a way of hiding the murderous possibilities of the government, if in fact you do not obey, and if you resist, because that's what this war was about. The South was right, and everybody thinks when you say the South was right, you are in fact endorsing slavery, and people do not understand that this war that was fought for 4 years, 6 million people were killed in this war, and people are trying to put forth and have put forth successfully this notion. This war is a war over slavery, and they were fighting this war over a moral claim that slavery is wrong, and to nix the South, they waged this war to extract from the South its slaves, because the morality was in the northern states and the South was acting immorally. And so this moral war was fought to get rid of slavery in this country. And yet when the war came to a close, we still had slavery in the country. The war ends, the Emancipation Proclamation has been invoked, and when the war comes to a close, we still have slavery. And that's why we have to have an amendment in the aftermath of the war to get rid of slavery, because we had slavery when the war came to a close. Why? Because there's slavery in the North that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't touch. Yet the war is over slavery, but the war comes to a close and we still got slavery in the country. And they have this absurd claim made that the government was acting in a benevolent way. Government is not benevolent, and our government is not benevolent here in this country and never has been benevolent. And we have got to understand the history of this country to go back and put it into the right context, because the government was as criminal under Lincoln, probably more criminal under Lincoln than it was under any other president, because Lincoln didn't free the slaves. By the time that slavery ended the United States, Lincoln was dead by 8 months. Slavery was ended in this country in December of 1865. Lincoln was assassinated April the 14th. 8 months before the slavery was in fact ended, Lincoln was in fact assassinated. And the assassin, by the way, said, having shot Lincoln, said, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning, and I don't ever see that being interpreted in these history books, meaning, and so be it to all tyrants. In other words, John Wilkes Booth was saying Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant, which is exactly the way I view Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln was a person that suspended habeas corpus. I thought it was only about 13 to 15,000 persons put in jail as political prisoners in this country. Now I'm reading in the two Kennedy brothers' books, James Robert Kennedy and Walter Don Kennedy, who wrote the book called The South Was Right. I'm now of the idea, given what they're writing and what they have documented in this book, 40,000 Americans were put in jail having no right to a trial by jury, because Lincoln had unconstitutionally suspended writ of habeas corpus. No different than what happened under the Democratic President Roosevelt, who put people in jail, incarcerated the Japanese, by the way, and put them in concentration camps in this country. Same thing. I mean, it's not just a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. Both Republicans and Democrats have valued these canons of the Constitution. So this idea that you have a partisan, you can go one party or the other party and you'll get some relief. We've been going back and forth ever since this country has been invoked by the Constitution. We've been going back and forth, starting with the Federalist Party and the Anti-Federalist Party, and the first two parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. We've been going back and forth from one party to another ever since the parties were set up in 1792. We had the Federalist Party, and we had Thomas Jefferson and the father of the Constitution, James Madison, that were coming out against basically Alexander Hamilton, and they were fighting for control. One party fighting the other party for control of the government back in that time period, from the 1790s all the way up until the present time. And that fight still goes on. But they're not fighting to carry out the Constitution mandates. They're fighting because there are two factions, both of which want to wield power in the United States. And we have you can go back and read about that in terms of the what amounts to the Patriot Act back in 1798, where you had, under the second president, you had John Adams, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a revolutionary, but a revolutionary out of power as opposed to a person in power where the government arrangement has been changed because his relationship to government has changed. In power, you have one idea. Out of power, you have a different idea. And so John Adams was on the commission to write the Declaration of Independence. Once he became president, John Adams, the second president of the United States, invoked anti-constitutional remedies to direct challenges to his power. And in 1798, John Adams signed into law the Alien and Sedition Act, which sounds a lot like the Patriot Act. If you read the Patriot Act, that was signed into law, you'll find it reads the same way as Alien and Sedition Act. So these attacks upon the Constitution of the United States continues. And the idea the government is in fact taking our Constitution seriously and is invoking it so as to maintain our rights and giving us our rights is nonsense. And it's nonsense at the beginning of this country's history. Nothing has changed in terms of that. The government is still the biggest threat to the liberty of the United States. Napolitano's book is also verifying and validating this point of view. It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. And the government is always wrong because the government is not a constitutional government. The government does not carry out the mandates of the Constitution. The Constitution is not government sanctioned. The government is sanctioned by the framers before they became elected office holders. The ratification of the Constitution took place in 1788. We don't have the election of the president, George Washington, until later on in 1788, because you have to have the Constitution that mandates the election of the president. So before you have the election of the president, you have the Constitution drawn up. And the Constitution is there to restrain the government. When the Constitution, therefore, is violated in the aftermath of the politicals taking power in the United States. So this idea that government is set up by the politicians is not true. It's set up by the framers before they became the politicians of the country. And those restraints placed against the power of the country was just as much aimed at their willing of power as it was aimed at the willing of power of their posterity. That's why they say, do ordain in this Constitution for ourselves and our posterity to pass these restraints down from that point in time all the way down to the present time. And our government is just as dangerous. It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. Our government is just as dangerous now as it's ever been. And governments are dangerous all over the world because governments are liberty-grabbing institutions. And they're out in the streets right now in France because they are understanding what Macron stands for. And they backed down Theresa May in England because they are recognizing what Theresa May was trying to do. Theresa May was trying to come behind the correct verdict of the people in England, and the verdict to get out of the EU, the European Union, the globalist union. And the people took a verdict, and Theresa May was trying to rescind the verdict by having another verdict, and the people came out to object to that. We're trying to impeach Theresa May, which made her last week come out and say that to have, in fact, taken that action forward, as she was trying to do, would have undermined democracy in England. In other words, she was saying that the people are aware of what the government was doing, and it made Theresa May back off. But what Theresa May intended to do was to undermine the voting of the people. It's not different there. It's the same thing that's going on here in the United States. They're trying to invoke the verdict of the people, but they can't be out in the open doing it, because if the people understood that their voice is not the final voice unless they pay attention to making so. If they don't pay attention, they don't have the final verdict here. The rulers do. And there are rulers in this country, there are rulers in England, there are rulers in France, and there's a ruling cabal in every country on the planet. The people's voice is not to be invoked unless the rulers agree with that voice. And sometimes they take them out of power through the impeachment. They try to do it out of the impeachment process. Have failed on 2 occasions there, because Andrew Johnson was not in violation of the Constitution. They claimed they made a political claim against Johnson, and Nixon, the claim made against Nixon, another political charge was made. They didn't carry it out through the Constitution. They carried it out through the press that was in fact resenting the verdict of the people, and they made it so that the political office holders could not back up Richard Nixon. They took him out of power without going through the constitutional process. Very clear in the Constitution. You remove a president from office based upon going through their elected representatives. You don't have the media taking a president out by running a coup, a propaganda machine coup against the president, which is what they did in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and what they're trying to do with Donald Trump right now. You take the president out through the impeachment process. And they're beginning to understand that it's not going to work. And so that's why they're now working the other angle. Before the next Congress takes charge on the 3rd of January 2019, before that happens, they want to have Donald Trump so dirted up that the people will finally accept them moving on Donald Trump by having the members of his own party, who don't support him anyway, making it impossible for them to back him up so that it doesn't go to impeachment. Of course, they got a problem here, because Donald Trump is not going to do what Richard Nixon did. Donald Trump is not going to stand down. And therefore, what that's going to do is cause all these Democrats who are claiming that they are Republicans, and of course you got Republicans claiming that we got Democrats who are nothing other than hidden Republicans, and we got Republicans who are, hidden Democrats. I don't mean they're Democrats in the sense that they believe in democracy. I mean they are inside of the same party. We only have a one-party system in the United States. They're disguised as 2 parties. Napolitano makes this comment in his book called "It's Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong." He asks this question on page 263. Do we have a 2-party system in America today? His answer is, I think not. We have one big government party. It has a Republican wing that prefers war, deficits, assaults on civil liberties, and corporate welfare. And we have a Democratic wing that prefers war, taxes, assaults on commercial liberties, and individual welfare. Neither wing is devoted to the Constitution, and members of both wings openly mock it, M-O-C-K, mock it. Will the Tea Party Republicans be devoured by the big government Republicans? I hope not, but I fear so. In other words, the Tea Party members would possibly go in there, and what they willed to do on the outside Once you get inside, you're part of. You're part of it.
Wasn't Paul Ryan elected as a Tea Party? Tea Party
Paul Ryan, who is getting out of town. Look at all of these persons that are getting out of town because they can't hide anymore that they are not quote unquote Republicans. Or in the other party, they're not Democrats either. We don't have Democrats and Republicans in government. The fact that you have persons contesting a duly held election 2 years after the election was held. Don't forget they had people going to Washington the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated, protesting the verdict of the American people on January the 21st, 2017. These were Democrats that were out there. To say that these persons are Democrats as opposed to being members of the Democratic Party is absurd. These are not Democrats. Democrats mean that you are willing to abide by the majority of the voters whose will is being carried out because the verdict is a majority taking the liberty to decide the fate of the country by saying that more people agree with this being the direction of the country than the other direction of the country. So therefore, the majority verdict is this and not the other thing. The majority voted in 2016 for Donald Trump, and the minority did not vote for Hillary Clinton. And they're trying to say, well, the Russians caused it. You know something? Even though, let's take that to be true. Of course, it's not true, but let's say that's true. Whatever the reasons why a majority went to the polls and voted for Donald Trump, that's still the verdict. It does. Whatever caused the people to go to the polls and vote, that still was their free will to go to the poll and vote. It doesn't matter as to what the interference was. Despite the interference, they went to the poll and voted Donald Trump in. It's a non-issue. Now, if you want to have the verdict changed, that's the next election. It's not the one we just had. So the Russians interfere with our election. The Russians have interfered with every election we've had in this country since 1917, and probably before that. But in terms of the Bolsheviks, that's not anything unusual. And you can go read these articles. They're trying to get you to be convinced something unusual happened in 2016. We'd never seen it before. Something happened in 2016, the first time we've had any governments trying to interfere in the election outcome of the United States. And that's something unusual that happened with Donald Trump. And before that, never happened before. The Russians were totally disinterested before 2016, and they caused an outcome that would not have occurred without that interference. And they're trying to act as if Russian interference is the same thing as collusion on the part of the duly elected president of the United States. Number one, all these people that you see pleading guilty, let me apprise you of something here that you need to look at. We have not had a single person that has been charged in this country with colluding with the Russians. And now we have this Judge Sullivan, who now is asking for the judge, and I think he's in New York, before the sentencing of Flynn. We have a judge in New York that's asking for the communication between the FBI as its internal communications before he sentences Flynn. He's asking for those communications to decide upon what happened to bring about his saying that he was guilty of lying when the FBI was saying at the time of his being he didn't know he was being interrogated, but it was really interrogation. He thought he was just simply sitting there having an informal communication, and didn't know that they were really holding him to account of what he had said. Although at that time they were saying they didn't think that Flynn was lying. They felt there was some inconsistencies, but they thought that he was actually telling the truth from what he understood that he was being asked. They didn't know that they had other testimony and record that would have shown that there was some difference in what he had said before and what he was saying at that time. And of course, if you have different memory at a certain time, more time goes by, your memory fades. So that could explain why there would be some discrepancy. But they were saying at that time that they did not think that Flynn was lying. The judge wants to see the data before he makes a judgment. And don't forget that Mueller, who's running a bogus investigation, Mueller's investigation is a red herring. Mueller is, in fact, this whole investigation is a hoax. Mueller is no longer, in fact, investigating Russian collusion. And that's why the judge is looking at over his shoulder, because he wants to see if, in fact, the FBI was, in fact, violating the rights of Flynn before it came down to them having this verdict that this man lied before the FBI. In other words, you see why it was at the end of the investigation, why it was that Mueller has asked for no jail time of Flynn. Why would that be the case? If he's in fact violating the law, why would there not be jail time? And so we'll see what happens here. But we have the government doing the same thing now in other cases that they're doing now because they do not respect the American people, and they want to overturn this verdict. Because you're not in charge, they're in charge. And we've got to alter that. Okay, we got to get out of here. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.